Welcome to the We Build Academy podcast. If you are thinking about building your dream home, you have come to the right place. We try to demystify the home building process to help you to build your dream home. Now introducing your host, Ryan Watt.
Hi, welcome to We Build Academy. In this episode, we're talking to Testa, who is an architect that has specialized in refurbishing buildings into low-energy homes. So in this episode, we're talking about maybe why you should consider refurbishing a building rather than actually looking for a completely clean plot of land. And also, what's the difference between achieving passive house on refurbishment compared to on a new build home? So if either of those two subjects are useful, please check out this episode.
So I'm Testa. I run a practice called Testa Architecture, which I started in 2010 as a kind of reaction to multiple redundancies over a short period of time, and wanted to sort of take control of that situation. And very quickly got interested in passive house as an approach to constructing sort of better buildings, mainly because actually the passive house community was really welcoming and really sort of accessible, which helped me to sort of get into that as an aspect of what we now try and do. And we also quickly gained a reputation for delivering planning permission on difficult sites. So that seems to be our other main thing. So we're kind of low energy in hopefully everything we do, but also quite often dealing with tricky sites, whether that's tricky topography, tricky planning constraints, or just very tight sites. So we've been doing that now for a number of years. I now have a business partner, Alan, who's sat opposite me. You can't see him, and a couple more team members. So yeah, we're growing, and it's an exciting time, I suppose.
Touched on the sort of the passive house community, and I think obviously a lot of people hear about this passive house as kind of a pretty much in the industry buzzword. But I think one key thing that people need to sort of understand, I think, is that there is a community and of experts, but also people have gone through the process, which are very passionate about it. Could you just talk a little bit about how some sort of key resources or anything particular that you found that it was quite good to get the ball rolling when you first started?
For me, it was social media. It was Twitter.
Okay.
And I maybe initially thought that perhaps it was the short nature of Twitter tweets that were allowing these people to feel they could give away quite a lot of information, because you couldn't go into that much detail. But as I've got to know these people a little bit better, everybody in this, let's call it community, is very, very willing to share, because ultimately what they want is better buildings. And it's not about, we do passive house, and if we do it and we can corner that bit of the market, then no one else does it. They really want everybody to be doing passive house. It doesn't want to be seen as an aspirational standard. It wants to be seen as a normal standard. So that's what's really fantastic about it. And so for me, Twitter has been really a really good resource, and I think anybody interested could get loads out of that just on its own. I think Elron Burrell, his passive house blog is really good. The Green Building Store have a blog, and that's really useful about the nitty gritty of the projects they've been working on. The AECB, so the Association of Environmentally Conscious Building, the UK Passive House Trust kind of came out of the AECB, so they're very, very closely linked anyway. But yeah, their conference is hugely welcoming for professionals, experts, but also for the general public who are interested. It's not a kind of closed group. So they're a really great community to get access to as well, I would say.
Yeah, I think that's what I'm finding is that in the passive house community and speaking to people is that everyone is very passionate about it, and as you said, is that everybody wants it to be the norm, and it's an onerous standard, but it's not. We had one architect on before who was doing her own sort of house, and she said when they actually looked at it, it wasn't that onerous because it was just good quality design.
Yes, it's just good building, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think that it was that the current level of expectation is quite low in building regulations and stuff like that. The actual reality is it's not much difference when you actually want to design a proper decent building out of it. Before we started, we were talking about a little bit about retrofitting. So if you want to deep dive into that sort of area and explain now to people a little bit more about that.
Yeah, so a lot of the clients that come to us have already got a house. They've got a home, and they still want to gain those sort of energy, comfort, and sort of health benefits of a passive house, or at least a very well designed, energy efficient home. So we do at least as much low energy retrofit as we do sort of low energy new builds. And often that's combined with an extension. So maybe the first thing they thought about is, we need a bit more space, or we need to reconfigure the home. And they think, well, whilst we're here and we've got this disruption, what else can we do to ensure that our home is comfortable for the long term? And sometimes that's quite incremental. So we'll speak to clients about, well, if you do this now, you can still do that, and you're not kind of missing an opportunity for the future. And other times we do everything all at once. So move the clients out of their home, gut it.
Go on a long holiday. So.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, insulate. New windows, air tightness measures, mechanical ventilation with heat recovery normally. And it's amazing how transformational it can be. I mean, I think it's not all about energy and comfort. For us, it has to go. If that's all you're doing, it's probably not best value for money. Actually, we think that we need to be making better spaces at the same time, and often we're dealing with homes that perhaps don't have the best layout or don't have the best daylight, for instance. So we're dealing with more than one problem for the client, hopefully, and giving them a much better home to live in by the time that work is finished. It's trickier, which is why there's an ENERFIT standard from Passive House Institute, which understands that you haven't got choice of geometry. That's already set. You haven't got choice of orientation. Quite often you can't amend window sizes particularly, and you're going to have thermal bridges that you just can't avoid because they're already there, and no matter what you do with your insulation, there's going to be some linear thermal bridges. So it accepts that as an issue, and so sets out a slightly less demanding energy performance target. So rather than 15 kilowatt hours per meter squared per year, it's 25, which is still amazing.
Yeah, it's still pretty good. I mean, that's, a normal house is about 50 to 60, isn't it? One that you get off the shelf, so to speak. So yeah,
but
it's
that's what they're designed to.
Yeah.
And what they might achieve is something very different. And then also an air tightness, instead of 0.6 air changes, it's 1. So it's just that little bit less demanding in that regard as well, which I would say is still probably more demanding to achieve a ENERFIT certification than it is to achieve Passive House certification on a new build, because of all those inherent issues, and also things that the only unknown when you're building a new build is what you're going to get in the ground. And ultimately that just determines normally how much concrete you're pouring. Whereas you could find something that you hadn't discovered in your early investigations on an existing home that would throw out some of your earlier PHPP work, or make your air tightness more difficult, so there's all sorts of issues that could arise. I guess also we quite like the idea of retrofit or at least getting more skilled up on it. We've got a huge existing housing stock that's not going to go anywhere. So we need to find ways of improving that as best we can, and finding ways that can be done economically, and with minimal disruption. Obviously, the ideal world, somebody does move out of their home for 6 months or whatever, but that's not practical for most people. No. So can we do this incrementally, or can we choose particular methods that limit the impact on people's lives as they live in the homes? So yeah, that's really important. Also, I just like the idea of the fact that you're not throwing away all this carbon that's already in that building structure.
Yeah, so you're reusing a lot of embedded energy already. So and you haven't got to do the groundworks as you touched on earlier, which could eat up to about 20 to 50% of your contingency before you even got out of the ground. So there is that bonus. So I mean, if I was a self builder, most people will obviously be living in a home at some point, and if they had the opportunity to either extend or stuff, so they'd be weighing up the options of retrofitting or getting another plot of land. I think the one advantage of actually staying where you are, and you could still develop the building and change the characters of the building quite a lot. But in terms of planning, have you found much problems in the retrofit market trying to accommodate any sort of aspirations?
Not generally significantly so. It will be more to do with the size of, say, an extension rather than the retrofit aspirations.
Okay.
I mean, obviously, if you're working in a conservation area, for instance, you might be limited to internal wall insulation rather than external. But it doesn't mean that you're completely prevented from doing high performance retrofit. You just might have to rethink the way that you approach that.
Okay.
I mean, one of the other benefits of retrofit, which isn't about working with your own existing home, is that we do often get people come to us and say, well, we'd like to build a new home that's really high performance and really comfortable. We'd like to build it in, let's say, Sheffield, because that's where we are. Can you help us find a plot? And that's a hugely difficult thing, and often you can spend as much on a plot as you would on an existing house anyway, because the value of homes are in the land really rather than the house themselves. So on a number of occasions we said, well, buy an ugly 60s house in an area that you like, and it will become ripe for retrofit and reorganisation and extension. But you've got over the issues of potentially agreeing the principle of building a house on that site with planning, and you've got over the issues of finding a plot, and also a lot of the structural work is already undertaken. So when we had that conversation with clients, some clients have gone slightly the other way and ended up buying very tricky to retrofit houses on very tricky sites. But
so always check with you before as a part of a due diligence.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So
I mean, I can imagine that the whole entire planning process is quite significantly reduced by. I mean, as a planner, you would be pretty hard passed, provided you're not putting a stupidly large extension on it. What you're doing is improving an existing building stock, as you said, and actually improving the energy. So it's pretty hard for them to not allow it, if that makes sense. So
yeah, exactly. And especially if you're talking about, I don't know, a house on a 60s estate, to change that from brick to render or some other cladding generally isn't seen as particularly difficult to come to terms with for a planner. It might be very different if you're in a beautiful Victorian suburb where you would have to preserve that street frontage, but still there are things you can do. It just will be more expensive and more complex, unfortunately.
So and just trying, you said with the Passivhaus retrofit, is it almost the same process as if you're doing a new build, or is it just with slightly different settings, or is there anything a little bit different that you need to take consideration?
If you're going down to Enefit, it's going to be more difficult to do that without modelling some thermal bridges.
Okay.
in Passivhaus, it's entirely possible if you've designed a very sort of robustly detailed building that you could achieve your certification without any thermal modelling of thermal bridges, because there might not be any, or if there are, they're kind of at an accepted level that you can be fairly sort of, let's say, conservative about within your PHPP, whereas it's likely you're going to have some significant thermal bridges that you will have to model. So there is that extra layer of complexity, and I think obviously you're surveying an existing building, both in terms of its physical size but also its construction, and trying to understand the baseline position that you're already in, firstly because that's useful as part of the design process, but also I think it's always really nice to show a client and say, well, your house currently uses, I don't know, 250 kilowatt hours per metre square per year, and now you're down at 25, so we've slashed that hugely, and I think for us also it's we haven't actually achieved an NFIT as yet. We've never actually gone that far because of cost constraints and things for clients. But what we have found is that by using the Passivhaus methodology, we're able to have really detailed conversations with our clients about where best to spend their money. Yes. So if they decide that I don't know, works to a particular building element are very expensive, we can go through the options of that building element and give them the real energy implications of those decisions. And we can always have that discussion in relation to whether that's NFIT or AECB silver, but also the kind of numbers that they're already used to.
How much is it going to cost them to run is normally the first question that you get asked, because no one really understands kilowatt hours or meter squared, and they understand what's the cost of how much. That's the thing. So sorry, just to be clear, in terms of when you say the complex modelling the thermal bridges, that's something that yourself gets up to, or is it you need to get a third party?
No, we would get a third party to do that. It's something I'd like to become a little bit more skilled at, but generally we would get someone else to do that. So it could be if you've got internal wall insulation, if you've got existing internal walls that are coming from that sort of cold external wall into the building, there are best practice ways of dealing with that cold bridge as best as possible. But if you're actually going to put that into your PHPP model and use that to achieve certification, you're going to need to get the actual numbers of what that's giving you, or be ultra conservative, which will probably mean you won't reach anything anyway, because you're just putting it too far out.
Yeah, I think the one key thing that you probably also touched on is that it's making sure that you have your right aspirations early on enough, and having those conversations with yourself on where to spend the money, because as you said, to spend it on the whole building and try and get the certification, you're going to have a diminishing returns. Whereas if you're going to put money in a certain area, it would probably best be invested in that one particular area rather than doing it the whole house and get the certification. Is there anything that would stop someone going for? If you buy a plot of land and you've got an existing building, have you ever had a case where someone actually there's always that debate when it's a retrofit, you're still paying VAT, is that correct? And when you're doing a new build, sometimes some people say if the building is that bad, it's worth knocking it down. But is in most cases, do you think retrofit is still more better value for money at the end of the day, or is there it's probably depending on situation by situation? But
it does depend on how much of the existing building you're keeping. If you, we're looking at a barn conversion at the moment, and we have to convert the barn. We have no choice under planning, so it's not really a kind of do we do this or not. But when you're stripping it back to just a steel frame, and that steel frame is then giving you 20% VAT on top of everything else. and you've got to do work to the steel frame to make the steel frame adequate for the project.
Yeah.
It starts to not make sense. Whereas if you've got you're still using all of your walls, floor structure, roof structure, even if you're re-roofing, putting new windows, new insulation, it's likely to be better value. So for most people, if we're dealing with a house, then for most people it's going to be better value, I would say. Yeah,
I think it's a very good option to consider when you're actually starting your sort of self-build journey. Do you go retrofit, or do you want to do self-build and stuff like that? I think it should be considered quite early on. So if we can move on to sort of like a bit of a tips section, is there what would be sort of main roadblock your clients tend to get when you start thinking about retrofit and passive house, or even just reducing their carbon? Is there anything particular that they hit?
I think it tends to be conflicts between aspiration and money. I mean, that's always the biggest thing. Retrofit is still an expensive thing to go deep retrofit. So kind of having those early conversations about budget and where best to spend that budget is really, really important. Now, if the budget is there to cover the retrofit, then actually, as long as we go through the process rigorously and understand the existing building and model that carefully, then bar the unknowns that you might find on any site, but and this less likely to be in the ground, but more likely to be in a bit of structure that might need replacing you didn't expect. There are that's great if they can afford that, but otherwise then it's about sort of setting priorities or setting something that can be sequenced over the life of the building. So there would be no point in doing a complete retrofit to the roof if the roof didn't need replacing. But you could do something now that could improve its thermal performance and its air tightness, and then when the roof comes to need replacing in 5, 10, 15 years time, then you can look at adding additional insulation and a breathable membrane, etc. And likewise, if you're coming to replace your windows, think long term and say, right, well, I'm going to replace my windows with really decent high performance triple glazed windows, even if when it comes down the line and I'm going to put external wall insulation in 5-10 years time, I might have to uninstall the windows and reinstall them in a better place in the construction. If you've got them, you've not lost that opportunity. So being willing to consider the long game as well is really useful, I think.
So in terms of costings, is there a sort of trick up your sleeve that you tend to use for costings? I know a lot of people get a little bit shy when they talk about trying to put two costs together. Do you do that yourself, or do you try and push them towards to get a QS, a quantity surveyor, or is it just benchmarks seem to work quite well?
So we have an initial benchmarking, which we find really, really useful. So we have a cost calculator on our website, which people can come and have a look at and use. It essentially uses baseline meter squared rates, but then with multipliers, and whether that's to do with if you're building new build on a steep slope, then that's going to have a multiplier that increases your cost. And likewise, if you're doing some basic retrofit work, we'll have a meter squared cost, but obviously the more work and the deeper you go, so we've got factors for that as well. And we find that as we go through projects that it's a very good indicator. And if people come into the project allowing for those kind of figures plus the professional fees, VAT, etc., which we're very clear and open about when we start a project, then it's a very good guideline, and normally they then have sufficient budget to do a decent job. We still recommend a quantity surveyor, or it depends on the kind of procurement we might be using. We might say, well, we're going to go with a contractor who's got experience of this particular kind of work. Let's introduce you to the contractor, and we might use that as our pricing point, knowing that we can negotiate that, or at least work through value engineering with that particular contractor. So, yes, but we would need an external costing expert at some point.
Yeah, I'm finding open book is becoming more and more popular, particularly on high performance houses. If you get a good, because you need to have a good contractor, one that you trust in the first place. Having an open book is quite a nice sort of relationship, and it works both quite well for both parties, really, rather than let's try and make it as cheap as possible. And,
yes, exactly.
And the mentality of the contractor.
I think that the clients need to realise that it's generally a competitive tender isn't going to deliver them. It might deliver them a slightly cheaper cost, but it isn't likely to deliver that with the best quality result. And if they were really to get the same quality result from any contractor, then it's likely to cost about the same. Most contractors cost about the same. Their time, materials, etc. It doesn't really change. So we much prefer that sort of either negotiated route where we work for a reasonable amount of time with the contractor, so they really understand the project, and then they are very comfortable with the price. They know that they've covered everything, and there isn't anything that's going to hit them. And likewise, we know that we've ironed out any issues that they might have otherwise picked up partway through the project, and that everybody's got a bit of buy-in, which I think is really useful, rather than, I've given you a price and we've accepted it and we started on site, and now I'm going to have a look at the drawings properly, which is what can happen.
Yeah, I do think some contractors put the spec on a weighing scales, and depending how heavy it is how much they cost it for it. Sorry, going to the last point, just to sort of summarize it. If you were going to recommend to someone thinking about retrofit, one tip, what one tip would you actually, just in one sort of sentence, what would you recommend?
Oh goodness, that's quite a hard question. One tip. I would say get someone who's actually willing to model the project. Now that might be Passivhaus, it might be another route, but it needs to go beyond best practice and guesswork. It needs to have some numbers attached to it. I think that's the most important thing, because you can make properly value decisions then about what you're going to do, what's important, because you've got the numbers to back that up.
Yeah, there's a famous quote I'm trying to remember about God we trust, everyone else bring data. I can't remember who said that, but it's sort of thing. But thanks for your time, Paul. How would people reach you, or do you have any particular way of people getting in contact with you?
The best thing to do is just visit our website, paultesterarchitecture.co.uk. So Paul Testa Architecture, all one word. We have lots and lots of resources on there. We have advice and a regularly updated blog, and you can sign up to our newsletter. And the cost calculator I mentioned is also accessible on our website. So.
I'll include a link to the cost calculator and your website as well, because I think that would be very useful, because as you touched on before, again, is that people's aspirations and pocket money is a little bit different sometimes. It's just good to get that kind of realism at the start of the project. Yeah, exactly. But no. All right, thanks for your time. And
Pleasure.
I hope you found Paul's tips useful. If you did, please make sure you visit webuildacademy.com and check out Paul's page. On there you'll find Paul's full-length episode, as well as a set of show notes and links to Paul's website. In particular, check out his cost calculator as well. That's very useful. So thank you for your time.
Thank you for listening to the We Build Academy podcast. Don't forget to click subscribe and check out our website, webuildacademy.com, for more great tools and information to help you build your dream home.